There's no indications this is a cure. What this is an indication of, in my opinion, is the ability to prolong the honeymoon period. Glycemic control is king in type 1 diabetes. The amount of insulin in the periphery can cause insulin resistance even of itself. So let's say you're someone who's worried about your long-term health. You're not going to be an Olympic athlete. You're not getting paid to exercise every single day, and you can have the same performance in either diet. Why would you do a diet that puts your biomarkers at risk for being elevated into at-risk range? And we saw that the ketogenic diet, despite elevations of LDL, did not appear to have any adverse effects on cardiovascular function, but actually seemed to reduce the risk.
Hey folks, it's Dr. Shawn Baker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up, though. Our spaces are filling up very quickly. Anyway, well, everybody, welcome with us today. We have Dr. Andrew Koutnik. He has a PhD in biomedical sciences, I believe he just told me, and background in exercise physiology. Type 1 diabetic, doing a lot of research on type 1 diabetes, and also looks like some stuff related to exercise performance, low-carb states, and stuff like that. So I want to start out with something a little bit controversial, and I think you're a great person to talk to about this. We are seeing people claiming in some of these low-carb, keto, carnivore groups, particularly carnivore, that they're seeing cures, and I'll put quotes around that, of type 1 diabetes, in the fact that they have some people that were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes that are now not requiring any insulin. Now, I've met a few of these people. I've talked to a few of them. It's unclear to me if maybe they're misdiagnosed, if it's, prolonged honeymoon period, if it's, LADA instead of, my understanding, and you know this better than I do, that type 1 diabetes is not completely monolithic. That is to say, there are some subtypes. There's a fulminant type. There's a autoimmune prevalent type, which is a majority. And then there's this idiopathic type. There may be more subtypes within that, perhaps. I don't know. I think there's some stuff around that. What are your thoughts on those claims? Because I know there's some people that are type 1 diabetics that are like, this is complete rubbish and it's nonsense to talk about. Me, I'm like, I don't know. Maybe there's a few people that's going on. Maybe we should study those people. I just talked to a lady yesterday, type 1. She said, I've got a group with a bunch of them. So I don't know. It's interesting to discuss. Thoughts?
Yep. So I have a ton of thoughts about this because we're actually funded by the NIH right now to study this. So there was a number of case reports that had come out over the last 10 years. I think we're now at 4 case reports or case series, actual reports that have come out. Some were published in PubMed index journals, some were not, which, people question the ones that are not PubMed index. Regardless, there was indications that individuals who underwent rapid carbohydrate restriction, some would argue that even more restrictive, like carnivore style diet, that individuals who had a full diagnosis with type 1 diabetes had antibodies, full-fledged autoantibodies, so confirming they had autoimmune forms of type 1 diabetes, and had C-peptide, a measure of insulin production, confirmed to be low, that when they went on one of these diets, that they were able to restore C-peptide. Okay, that's really important because just showing normal glycemia in early onset type 1 diabetes doesn't mean a whole, it's important, it's powerful, but it doesn't tell you a lot because the destruction of the beta cells that produce insulin and control glucose levels deteriorate over time. And they deteriorate much slower on average in adults. As a result, if someone were to immediately go on a diet that reduces the amount of insulin being put into the bloodstream and the amount of glucose being produced, as you would expect that maybe the residual amount that's still left, they're not at the tail end of full destruction, is able to control the food they're eating. And so it doesn't mean that they reverse the disease. But when you see a C-peptide elevation, a restoration of C-peptide, that's a totally different situation. And multiple of these case series and reports had shown that. I am of the belief there's no indications this is a cure. What this is an indication of, in my opinion, is the ability to prolong the honeymoon period. So once you get diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder, in this case type 1 diabetes, that has developed autoimmune antibodies towards the insulin-producing beta cells, in theory, to the best of our knowledge, there's no one doing this. Once you have autoantibodies towards that pancreas, unless you're not able to basically rewire your immune system to not do that anymore, to the best of our scientific advancements at this stage. So you're stuck with that autoimmune attack. That's why all curative therapies in type 1 diabetes have largely failed to prolong the ability to not have, the beta cell replacements, islet cell replacements. They've all failed largely because the immune system still detects them and kills them. The only exception to this, Shawn, is when you're on chronic immunosuppressants, which also carry multi-year long-term risk, almost analogous to type 1 diabetes risk. So you're kind of trading one for the other. And so that was kind of more of a long-winded answer, but the short-winded answer is the evidence, in my opinion, suggests that this is a prolongation of the honeymoon period, and that there is probably immunological changes associated with the diet and also the reduced burden on the pancreas itself that is helping to allow for the beta cells that are present to attenuate their destruction, the rapid nature of their destruction, and potentially allow for attenuation of the immunological attack on the cells that control blood sugar. That's what I think.
So a couple comments. So, I mean, you probably know this. Back in the 1920s, before they discovered insulin, there was a guy named Louis Newberg at University of Michigan was putting people on high-fat, low-protein diets to control glycosuria, because that's all they could really measure back then. And these people would come, they would be septic and sick and on their deathbed, as many diabetics get untreated. And they were able to reverse that. And some of them were able to return to their careers and stuff like that on a diet, and maybe they prolong the honeymoon period. But and I mean, if you look at the anti-GAD antibodies or the anti-insulin antibodies that a lot of type 1 diabetics have, I've not seen anybody, maybe you said you saw some people where that's gotten lower. I know with things like there was a study out of China done on a different autoimmune disease, Hashimoto's, and they showed the low-carb diet actually resulted in a decrease in anti-TPO. So, I mean, we did see a decrease in antibody, anti-antibodies being produced. So I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting to see, and it'd be interesting to see if these people that are making these claims could sort of get tested, maybe have antibody levels pre and post and C-peptide levels and so on and so forth. But I mean, because obviously there's artificial pancreases, there's stem cells that I've seen being talked about. What is the push to cure diabetes type 1 right now? Is there any real thing on the horizon that looks promising? I mean, it's always on the horizon, it seems. It never pans out.
Right. Well, there's actually a drug that recently came out which was shown to prolong the honeymoon period by up to 2 to 3 years in a lot of patients, a lot of meaning late adult onset diabetes, basically type 1 diabetes in adulthood that's slower progressing on average. They were able to use a drug that was immunomodulator, so a drug that changes the immune system, and a 2-week treatment of that. So you get 2 weeks of basically treatment infusion of this drug, and you are able to, on average, prolong the honeymoon period for 2 to 3 years. So that's actually a pretty remarkable improvement. The problem is that drug is currently like $100,000 to $200,000 per patient, unless you're in a clinical trial. So it's really not achievable or accessible for most people. Honestly, frankly, completely unrealistic unless you're like absurd amounts of money, because it's only giving you 2 to 3 years. You're still going to get the disease. And it's only been shown to work, at least in clinical settings that are published, in adults. So now they're doing clinical trials all the way up to kids. I actually know some kids who are in these trials. I know some doctors who are in these trials as well, who are friends of mine. And so that's what's the most promising thing on the horizons. Historically, Shawn, the treatments have focused on stem cell replacement therapies, islet cell replacement therapies. And you see all these like one-off curative type of reports that come out. They are in big journals. They get a lot of highlights and major news outlets. The problem is that if you really look into the details of these, I have yet to see a report that did not require the patient to be on chronic immunosuppressants. That is kind of the gatekeeper. Once there's a curative therapy that automatically, in my opinion, what would be the next step? Like if I could say, what would I take? I guess is maybe a good way to frame this. If there was a therapy that I could take that I don't have to chronically administer, it's something that I take at a one-time point, or maybe like an acute time point, or maybe at intervals, but not every day for the rest of my life. It didn't have adverse effects on the rest of my risk for other diseases or longevity, which immunosuppressants do. It's cost-effective and accessible. And again, and I want to double down on this, not any negative long-term side effects that impair other aspects of quality of life, because you're trading one for the other when that happens. If that's the case, that would be amazing. But all therapies right now that look like they quote unquote cure diabetes are replacing beta cells, islet cells, either through stem cell transplant. There was a study in 2000, it was in New England Journal of Medicine, where they did islet cell transplant therapy, and it literally revolutionized the field. One of the most cited papers of all time in type 1 diabetes, shifted millions of dollars in fundings for decades towards curative therapies. But the end result of that trial is that almost all those patients got back on insulin, HbA1c rose, and the islet cell transplants were destroyed over time by the immune system. So until that immune system component is corrected or overcome through technologies or advancements or something along these lines, that's really the last frontier of overcoming this. What's working right now is immunomodulators, things that actually change the immune system and are able to extend the honeymoon period for up to 2 to 3 years. I suspect that innovation, Shawn, is going to guide future innovations to build on that success.
Let me shift gears a little bit, and this has applicability both to type 1 and type 2. One of the main reason we don't want diabetes is the end organ damage, the blindness, the the retinopathy, the nephropathy, the cardiovascular disease, everything. I mean, diabetes wrecks every part of your body, quite honestly. I see people that are critical of low carb approaches saying that, you're just masking the symptoms. Yeah, you can have a nice A1C, you can show a flat CGM, but really you're not really taking care of the disease. And I know, because you've actually read a report on yourself on 10 years and looked pretty intensely at some of this end organ information. And what I see is type 1 and type 2 diabetics, if they change their diet significantly over a period of time, they're actually seeing reversal of retinopathy, reversal of nephropathy. So let's talk about, because this is applicable to both type 1s and type 2s. I know a lot of people that are type 1 get mad when we talk about type 2s, but I think the one of the better treatments shares some common denominators, I suppose. What are your thoughts on managing type 1 as someone who lives with this? What do you found to be most efficacious?
You actually bring up, in my opinion, Shawn, one of the most important questions that could ever be brought up around treatment management in the context of type 1 diabetes, particularly the low carb or nutritional controversy, which shouldn't be controversial at all, in my opinion. If something works, it works. Somehow nutrition gets thrown into a mud pit every time something works with it, particularly if it's low carb. When you're going to do any treatment for any disease management, in my opinion, there's always a pro and con. Okay. This applies to everything in life, right? I'm going to go spend my time exercising. I'm not going to be doing something else with that time. So there's a cost benefit analysis to everything. When you do low carb, same thing applies. So what type of logic can you apply towards what you should and shouldn't do as a therapeutic intervention for disease? And in this case, we're talking about type 1 diabetes. Well, you should look at what are the most important and critical biomarkers that can be moved to improve whatever your said outcome is. Well, for people with type 1 diabetes, the most robust biomarker that affects quality of life, so how you feel every day, is glycemic control. Not even close. Nothing comes anywhere close to this. It's glycemic control. Most patients live on an average of about 180 milligrams per deciliter, which is 10 millimolars for those not in the United States or using Euro metrics, and have a deviation around 60 milligrams per deciliter above and below that. So we're looking at around 3 millimolar above and below that. Huge deviations, very high blood sugars that cause symptoms of every moment of every day. So physical symptoms, mental health symptoms. So the quality of life of poor glycemic control, which is what 99% of patients have, is directly impacted. Glycemic control directly impacting how people feel in this moment. I'm standing here, Shawn, if I have high and variable blood sugars, it's going to affect the way I feel today. It's going to affect the way I interact with my family, with my colleagues, and beyond. What about long-term implications? So we know that when you look at kids who are diagnosed, so their kids are usually some of the healthiest people on earth, relatively speaking, immune to most diseases, at least chronic diseases that are lifestyle-based. And you look at kids who are diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, they see signs of atherosclerotic progression within 4 years. Okay, it may even be happening faster than that. We just don't have data sooner than that. We see neuroanatomical changes within these kids within 4 years. Again, we don't have data earlier than that. We just have these 4-year post time points, post-diagnosis, where we see direct shifts in neuroanatomical structure. And we see a consistently reduced IQ in patients with type 1 diabetes. And again, if you look at the data, you see all these changes are occurring pretty early on, even in kids post-diagnosis. Again, all associated with glycemic control. In fact, there was one study that I think is really powerful to highlight, that kids in one of the largest trials ever conducted, the DCC and EDIC trial, they did some side analysis, and they did brain MRI scans of kids. Actually, this might be a separate trial from the DCC and EDIC, but nonetheless, there was an MRI scan of the neuroanatomical development in kids over a longitudinal period. And they looked at A1C in association with neuroanatomical development in kids with type 1 diabetes. What they found is that kids who had type 1 diabetes compared to age control counterparts who had similar scans had impaired neurological development in key parts of the brain associated with maturity or brain maturation, meaning that kids' brains aren't developing in the same way if they get diagnosis with type 1 diabetes, again, associated with consistently lower IQ levels. That was associated in a dose-dependent manner with the level of HbA1c. So how poor was your glycemic control dictated how affected your brain would be on these scans. This is all to say, Shawn, that I can cite multiple parts of evidence that say glycemic control is king in type 1 diabetes. And so, in fact, there was a study in 2016 from the DCC and EDIC group by David Nathan looking at the risk factors for cardiovascular disease, the number one cause of death of people with type 1 diabetes. Tenfold higher risk for cardiovascular disease in type 1 diabetes. And so what's the most important risk factor? HbA1c. It's not even close to anything else. And so even if you control HbA1c into a relatively normal range, Shawn, you still have a slightly elevated risk for cardiovascular disease, which means that other things are important, like elevated insulin levels, insulin resistance, things that do occur in type 1 diabetes, like they do occur in type 2. But glycemic control is king. And as a result, if you're worried about improving your health, would you worry about the thing that really has marginal impact? Like, people talk about LDL and the controversy of LDL elevations with ketogenic diets. If you look at the hierarchical risk, that's number 10 on the list in type 1 diabetes. Number 1 is HbA1c. If you consider the other modifiable lifestyle factors you can improve, like you can't change your age, but you can, triglycerides is more important. Blood pressure is more important. Resting heart rate is more important. Those are all things that in theory could move in the right direction with a diet like this. But HbA1c is one of the most critical ones. So if you're looking to improve your health with type 1 diabetes, in my opinion, the logical approach is to look at what's most important to almost all major biomarkers and health outcomes, both lived experience today, Shawn, but also across your entire lifespan. And that's glycemic control. Not even close. Any biomarker doesn't even come close to this. And as a result, once you fix that, then you can start talking about other things. But I always use the analogy, it's like having a car and you're worried about the rims on the car and the engine's broke. It's just illogical. Focus on the engine. It's much more important to the function. Then maybe you get some shiny rims later, okay? But focus on the engine.
Let me just interject something here. So if we're saying that, glycemic control, how variable it is the most important factor, and that's probably more important than having a low on A1C with a bunch of, crazy ups and downs and spending a lot of time low. But some people would say, well, I'm just going to, I've got a pump. We've got some really nice insulin delivery systems now and feedback, a lot of closed circuits where you can, run your pump directly into CGM and it can dose it. So you could just say, well, I'm just going to eat whatever. I'm eat a little more carbs. I'm just going to take a little more insulin in and still keep pretty good control. What about the overall amount of insulin you're exposed to as a type 1? I've seen studies that show that type 1s that consume more than like 0.8, units per kilogram are at twice the risk for cancer as someone who uses, say, less than 0.5. What are your thoughts on overall amount versus just control?
So you bring up two separate points that are worth addressing here. Number one is the closed loop systems. Those only work at night when food isn't present. They have almost no meaningful impact, and it's very marginal during the day when food is present. That alludes to something very important, that it can't overcome whatever's happening during the day, and nutrition is the most potent impact on glycemic control. So it obviously alludes to the idea that nutrition can't be overcome by these new technologies or closed loop systems. So I just want to say that up front. I actually made a video about this a long time ago just to illustrate to people that these systems are amazing. They reduce the burden of disease, but they can't overcome poor nutritional habits when it comes to glycemic control. Then you mentioned insulin. So people in type 1 diabetes, I think, only recently became aware of this. This information has been around since the 1980s by Ralph DeFronzo. So Ralph DeFronzo was a researcher who ended up becoming kind of like a kingpin in insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity as far as a researcher goes. And he's out of Texas. And what he found is that people with type 1 diabetes, despite having historically lower body weights, this is back in the 1980s, before like people with type 1 diabetes now have the same levels of obesity as people in the general population. They used to be underweight and at most normal body weight. So back then, when that was the case, they were finding that patients with type 1 diabetes had the same amount of insulin resistance as those with type 2 diabetes. And people were like, well, there's no way that's possible. Insulin resistance is the cornerstone of what defines type 2 diabetes. And type 1 diabetes is insulin deficiency. No, they don't have insulin resistance. No. They do. Because Shawn, some people may be listening to this on podcasts or be watching this, but those who are watching this, the back of my arm is an insulin pump. That insulin pump is on my arm. It's on my external body, on my peripheral tissues. That pump is not inside my body, directly releasing insulin into the hepatic portal vein. This is an important distinction for people to realize when it comes to how insulin is administered and the impact it has. Shawn, when you eat food, well, let's say you were to go eat like 500 donuts, or like even a donut. You probably don't do this. I assume you don't do this based on what I understand. No. Yeah. Let's say you did. Let's say you ate a donut. Your body is going to release insulin from pre-stored granules directly into circulation in a dose-dependent manner within seconds to minutes of elevation of blood glucose. That will go directly to the liver, and the liver will eat up 60 to 75% of that initial amount of insulin and store most of that into the liver to store as glycogen for future glucose homeostasis. The rest will reach the periphery, meaning like 33 to 25% or less of the insulin that's released due to carbohydrates, let's say, or protein to a much lower degree, is actually only reaching the periphery. In type 1 diabetes, that ratio is reversed due to the artificial route of administration, which is from the exogenous peripheral tissues internal. So by this insulin on the back of my arm going into the back of my tricep, it's first going into the fat tissue. That fat tissue has to then take that insulin and move from the fat tissue to a capillary bed, be absorbed into circulation, get into systemic circulation, and then reach tissues where it can bind and then bring glucose in. That means that the periphery, the vasculature in the periphery, is where most of the insulin is, and only a small fraction of that in type 1 diabetes reaches the liver, enough to shut down gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis and whatnot, because you don't need very much to do that. But overwhelming amounts are in the periphery. So what Ralph DeFronzo showed is that seems to be driving insulin resistance. What that also showed us as scientists, as a scientific biomedical community, is that the amount of insulin in the periphery can cause insulin resistance even of itself. Even if your normal body weight, don't have excess adipose tissue or excess lipids or proteins floating around, which most people with type 1 diabetes don't, or didn't historically when this was discovered. There's a meta-analysis now of this, Shawn, showing that every single study ever where people with type 1 diabetes were assessed showed signs of elevated insulin periphery and insulin resistance. So this is not I think this might be happening thing. It is happening. So speaking to friends like Justin Gregory, who do this for a living, they actually study insulin resistance in type 1 diabetes. This is what they do. This is all they do. The name of the game is, well, what can you do right now? And obviously more insulin in the periphery would certainly logically lead to more insulin resistance. The less insulin that is around to cause insulin resistance. I mean, what's causing it is more insulin in the periphery. That's what's causing it. So if you lower that, logically, that would help with insulin resistance. And one way for patients to just understand this is the amount of total insulins you are utilizing is a surrogate marker for insulin sensitivity or use. And in type 1 diabetes, you monitor insulin and glucose 24/7 with more insights on your metabolism biomarkers than anyone alive. And as a result, you see this all day, every day, And you can see how much insulin you're taking. So I can tell you, Shawn, if I go for a walk today, or if I hit 10,000 steps, or even close to that, I'll reduce my insulin requirements 10 to 25+% for that day. Everyone's like, oh, look, this study over here in the, 10 years ago showed 10,000 steps improves health. I can show you, Shawn, like people with type 1 diabetes have known this for decades because they just use less insulin. And so if you are a patient with type 1 diabetes, you just have to look at the total amount of insulin you're using and find strategies that reduce that over time. And nutrition's the biggest one, but obviously lifestyle, exercise, and all these other factors play a role.
Hey folks, it's Dr. Shawn Baker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up, though. Our spaces are filling up very quickly. Let me ask you a question, because you work out, you lift weights. I've seen you, you're getting after it. You're putting on muscle. You want to have more muscle, but that's more muscle. My assumption is going to mean more insulin required to maintain that muscle. So how does that part of the puzzle fit in there, or does it?
Yeah. So Shawn, I'm actually only looking at the deadlifts you hit and your reps and the weight, and I'm just trying to beat it. So, whenever that happens, I'm going to post a video and tag you in it.
I look forward to it. Good for you.
I'm not there yet, though. Trust me. Shawn's got world record levels of strength here. So if you have more muscle, so I guess it's proportional, right? So if you have more muscle, but you also have a ton of adipose tissue, that adipose tissue is going to perpetuate insulin resistance. It's actually an interesting, complex question, because I never really thought of it the way you asked it before, because in general, more muscle mass is often associated with less insulin resistance, because people who have more muscle tend to exercise more, do things that actually increase insulin sensitivity. But there is obviously scenarios where someone could be obese, and as a result, because they're heavier and they carry more weight load, they may actually retain more muscle just to carry that weight. And so it's not always per se the muscle. I would argue, Shawn, that the most important thing revolving overall insulin sensitivity is doing things that increase it. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is to resistance train sufficiently hard for sufficiently long, and also do things like aerobic exercise. Now, some people hate aerobic exercise, but I would argue it's kind of important for cardiovascular health in general. But nonetheless, doing things that increase muscle mass are also usually the things that increase insulin sensitivity. Although the increase in insulin sensitivity is usually short-lived. So you have to keep doing it. You can't just exercise one time and all of a sudden you're good. You need to exercise repeatedly over time. It needs to be a lifestyle habit. And there's studies on this in type 2 diabetes where they show the effect of insulin sensitizing effect of things like resistance exercise or hybrid training, like aerobic and resistance together, can last up to 48 hours. But then you have to do it again to retain that insulin sensitizing effect. So I think it's much more so, Shawn, the things that allow for greater muscle mass that increase insulin sensitivity. I don't know if anyone's ever done a control for looking at someone with greater muscle mass, but less activity, all things matched, and that higher volume of overall muscle mass is needing more insulin. In theory, Shawn, if you're a bigger person, you may need more insulin in general to retain that size. So in theory, that could be correct, but usually the things you do to get muscle are so much more powerful in reducing insulin sensitivity that it would far outweigh it. An example is actually myself. The amount of insulin I take is around 30 to 35 total units per day. That's equivalent to a prepubescent teenager before they hit puberty.
What do you weigh? What do you weigh?
Around 232 right now pounds.
105 kilos or something like that, somewhere in there.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit less than 10% body fat right now. So, and I exercise every day. So there's that, sometimes 2 times a day. So there's that. But yeah, so the lifestyle factors are much more important. Body composition, lifestyle factors play a bigger role, I think.
Because I saw you posted something yesterday, something that I've been aware of for a number of years now, is that athletes, surprisingly, even some very, very fit world-class athletes, have surprisingly high blood glucoses. And some of that is, as you mentioned in your post, hey, maybe their nutritional strategy, they're pounding a bunch of carbs, they're always carb loading. That has a bigger impact than anything else. But some of that I wonder about, like type of exercise. I mean, as you know, exercise is stressful. You get a pretty big release of counter-regulatory hormones sometimes. That's going to cause glycogenolysis, so you dump some glucose so you perform. How much do you think is that? I mean, because my question is, if I see somebody like, I've done it where I've gone on a really heavy deadlift session wearing a CGM and my glucose will go up. I mean, it'll come back down, but it'll go up. So is that rise in glucose while it's going up there actually damaging me, or is that physiologically appropriate and there are compensation mechanisms going on during the aroused state, I suppose? I'm just wondering about what your thoughts on that are.
So I think it's the latter. I think in your case where you have you're doing something positive that's stressful, you're not giving you're not in a work environment where someone, threatened to, eviscerate your job or terminate you and you had a blood glucose increase. That's a different thing than having something like exercise, which has a positive associated benefit with the stress associated with it over time. So that, and I would argue, is just a phenomenon of physiology and is a positive. I wouldn't say it's a negative. It's definitely not a negative. And it's definitely certainly not causing more damage than the benefit of exercise was inducing. And usually the elevation is not sufficiently high either to really market and for long enough to market any serious damage. What was found, something we saw back in a study we conducted, randomized controlled trial. This was alongside Philip Prin's group at Grove City College, Tim Noakes, others. I want to give credit to the whole team here, is that what we did is we took 10 athletes who were running 50 kilometers per week, advanced runners who were lean, usually around less than 15% body fat, high VO2 max, is like the epitome of what you'd say it helped. They're middle-aged though. And the reason we want to look at middle age is because usually the young, at least historically, were largely immune to disease. And then 65 or older were somehow at high risk for disease. Even no matter what you did, you're still at higher risk. So there's this middle ground of what is happening between this super immune and super advanced. Obviously, you can point and say, well, obviously it's aging. But we wanted to look at this unique group where you don't have full onset disease. You're doing supposedly everything right. But what happens if you do two different types of diet? The main question actually more so here, Shawn, was performance. Like if we do this really short duration max effort performance for 1 mile time trial or 6 by 800 meter sprints, this like very, very intense form of exercise. If no one's done a 1 mile time trial, you will probably never appreciate how actually hard that is to go full-fledged effort for that. But what we found in this is that we put CGMs on these individuals, had them adapt to the diet for 4 weeks. The duration of the diet is an important factor, but I'll spare you the details here. And over that 4 weeks, we found that 30% of the athletes, body mass index, all low body fat, all running over 50 kilometers per week, all high VO2 maxes, avid athletes, had glucose levels, not just in a single biomarker, but over 4 weeks, every 5-minute assessment using continuous glucose monitoring, over multiple sensors too. So it wasn't just one sensor, it could have been error. No, we confirmed this with capillary measurements, multiple sensors over 4 weeks, not one time shot, showed these athletes, 30% of them had indications of prediabetes. So blood glucose levels consistent with prediabetes, not over the 24-hour window only, but actually also during their fasted window. Okay, so consistent with prediabetes. That was eye-opening to us. I would never expect this. However, when you look historically in the literature, we started pulling all of our studies that we had conducted. We actually reached out to some colleagues who had found this as well, or had CGMs and athletes of various ages, and actually looked at the historical literature and started looking at fasting values. And the incidence was not zero. The incidence was ranging somewhere between 5%. Well, in some studies, it was 0%, but other studies, it could be as high as 30+% of the athletes were showing indices of prediabetes. And at least at face value, someone will say, well, no. There's all these other reasons why someone can get elevated glucose levels that aren't necessarily adverse to health. But here's the kicker here, Shawn, is that, I think to kind of come back full circle to what this matters to people is, we found that the people in the high carb diet had prediabetes. When they lowered carbs, they had the same performance, even though it was super short duration and high intensity on low carb diets, but they resolved their glucose levels for prediabetes. So let's say you're someone who's worried about your long-term health. You're not going to be an Olympic athlete. You're not getting paid to exercise every single day. And you can have the same performance in either diet. Why would you do a diet that puts your biomarkers at risk for being elevated into at-risk range? Well, some of the pushback on this has been, well, if you're doing these long duration forms of exercise, prolonged endurance exercise, there is data that says that form of exercise, at least immediately post that exercise, can cause insulin resistance and reduce glucose tolerance. The belief for why that isn't that it's pathological. It's that the body is liberating fat in order to substantiate the exercise demands that can cause elevated insulin resistance in the periphery. But it's short-lived. But what if we're one of these ultra endurance athletes or Ironman competitors who's doing like 4 to 8 hours of exercise a day? You're in that window of time for a longer period of time. But again, 4 to 8 hours. The problem, I believe, Shawn, is that there's this overwhelming dogmatic thinking that you need these super high carbohydrate diets to perform optimally. And we have repeatedly shown, and as well as other investigators, that if you habituate to any diet for long enough, you in theory will perform exactly the same. What seems to be more consequential is where you time things like carbohydrates immediately before or during exercise. And for most people, that's a moot point. But if you're an elite level athlete, maybe you start caring about the percentage differences, in your 2 mile, your marathon. But for most people, that doesn't matter. You should be worrying about what improves your overall health. But yes, Shawn, there is data that says that long duration, prolonged, strenuous endurance exercise can, at least short term, likely due to the physiology required to substantiate that exercise, is causing potential insulin resistance in some athletes and reduced glucose tolerance. That's not believed to be pathological. It's believed to actually fuel exercise demands. But if you're exercising for 48 hours a day, and that's causing some degree of insulin resistance and reduced glucose tolerance, on top of the fact, Shawn, that you believe you need these super high levels of carbohydrates and pound back very rapidly absorbable forms of carbohydrates, you're exposed to very high levels of glucose frequently, and you might be getting insulin resistance to the type of exercise for how long it is within your day. As a result, you're exposed to a lot more glucose. And there was an example, Lionel Sanders, who's a world-class triathlete. He placed first place in 2017 in a really prominent race and had second in kind of the prominent Ironman competition. And he was super brave and came out publicly and said he had prediabetes. But he also said, Shawn, that he had symptoms. He felt fatigue. His mental health wasn't in a good spot. He had issues around recovery. He just wasn't feeling good. And he went to go get checked. Everything, quote, looked normal. Again, this is his story. And he said, the one thing elevated, everything looked fine. The one thing elevated is HbA1c. So he said, okay, I'm concerned about this. He made lifestyle changes, which were reducing carbohydrate intake, reducing these highly processed carbohydrate forms, saw a 20 milligrams per deciliter improvement in glucose almost instantly. And he said, for the first time, I walked outside and was excited for my day. So not only he changed his nutrition, which was associated with a change in glucose, but now his symptoms resolved and he felt better. And of course, that has a lot of importance for someone who's making money around their exercise performance. But just that applies to a lot of people, because we know that over 50% of the population over 20 years of age has prediabetes, according to NHANES data, CDC data, and World Health Organization data, and 80% of the people who have it do not know it. That is a problem. And I think this idea of how to perform optimally, particularly around highly processed forms of carbohydrates or rapidly assimilated form of carbohydrates, again, this isn't the point of finger at carbohydrates. Do whatever you want. But we have to at least highlight that you might not need those things, first of all. And if they're exaggerating any issues you have from metabolic disease or dysfunction, which for some people can, in Lionel's case, here's videos of him consuming over 750 grams of carbs a day. So, not recommended for most people, obviously, but he's an elite level athlete making money doing this and competing at the highest level and placing first and second place in some of these races. And even he is seeing the consequences of this. So there's always this joke, you can't outrun a bad diet. Well, even elite athletes can't outrun a bad diet in this particular case. So it isn't so much that, some people have said, well, it's only 20 milligrams per deciliter difference. Like that change in glucose isn't physiologically relevant. And I agree with that. But it's not the blood glucose level that matters. It's what is underlying that is a signal. The glucose elevation is a signal for all the other things that is causing that blood sugar to elevate. High insulin levels, maybe poor sleep habits, poor stress levels, all these other things that are underlying that is exaggerating that elevation in blood glucose. So, it's composite, and I think that it's important to appreciate. But I think a lot of the nutritional recommendations around exercise have unfortunately exaggerated this belief structure around requirements of certain nutrients And those are also the nutrients that predispose some individuals to overconsume. And I think we got to be cautious about that because even elite athletes aren't immune.
Yeah, I mean, you may be familiar with a guy named Steve Redgrave, who was the 5-time Olympic gold medalist rower, who, during his 5th gold medal, he got diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And he was, by every definition, one of the fittest guys on the planet, right? So we've seen that before. And I know like the ISSA, International Society for Sports Nutrition, ISSN, Jose Antonio's group, recently came out with a comparison. I think Alex Leaf was a guy that wrote some of this stuff up and said, ketogenic low-carb diets are inferior or neutral, but most of the criticism was around, I was saying most of the studies were short-lived, so we don't have any long-term studies. And as you pointed out, there is an adaptation period. And as I would say, as someone who's chronically adapted to a very low approach in setting world records on things like rowing machines, I'm like, I can perform fine. I can certainly match my age group and beat most of my younger peers. But the other thing that's interesting to me is that as an orthopedic surgeon, when I used to look at people's knees and I'd go in there and a young 15-year-old kid would be super white and clean. I'd get in there and a 50-year-old look like the inside of an ashtray, all yellow, discolored. And the reality is it was becoming glycated. And again, what's associated with tissue glycation is unstable blood glucose, high glycemia, fructose in the blood as well, and then lipid peroxidation products seem to drive that. The question I want to ask about is protein, because as a type 1 diabetic, you obviously, and I've talked to Richard Bernstein, I'm sure you're familiar with him, protein you have to dose for. And in some cases, protein can cause a release of glucagon, which then causes the liver to break down glucose. And so we see this interaction between glucagon and insulin. How do you manage protein? I mean, obviously, you're a fan of lifting like I am, body composition, putting on muscle, you need protein for that. How does the average type 1 diabetic or even type 2 diabetic handle protein? Is there a possibility where there's too much protein? Possibly. I guess that's the question.
Yeah, great question. So to Alex Leaf's first point, so I did see that article, and they put a damn lot of effort into that effort. I actually know Alex Leaf was Jose Antonio's student back in the day, and so yeah. But one key point you bring up is the timeline to diet, and I will contend that that's actually not a small point. It is a massive point of differentiation between where low carb diets show either a neutral or better performance versus showing a deterioration performance. That timeline, in my opinion, is one of the most important factors. And so you cannot disregard, and obviously you mentioned that, so I just want to make sure I point that out. When you think about the idea of, well, I want to back up for a second because I want to make sure I'm going direct to your point around protein. So how does someone with type 1 diabetes handle protein? Well, if you look back in 1983, the study by an individual named Collier, Collier, and what they looked at was the insulin requirements of carbohydrates, protein, with or without fat. And what they found is that if you had carbohydrates, it was 50 grams of potato. And so it was like real food. It wasn't like, you gave you one of these, fake lab drinks. It was real food. And what they found is that carbohydrates had about 2.5 times as much insulin per gram of food consumed. But protein still had some insulin requirements. And when you add fat to protein, it didn't seem to change the insulin requirements at all. It might just change when the peak of the protein happens and how long it lasts for. So it delays the peak, prolongs how long the glucose elevating effect is, and insulin requirements for it. Interestingly, when you add fat to carbs, it actually reduced the overall insulin requirements in half, which is kind of remarkable, but either way. Oh, sorry, not the insulin requirements, but the glucose requirements, largely because of probably digestion and the ability for insulin to manage it. Regardless, to your point, when someone is eating protein, they do have to bolus with insulin. The way most people bolus, when you say, what does the average person with type 1 diabetes bolus? Unfortunately, Shawn, that if I answer that question directly, average person with type 1 diabetes doesn't bolus for protein. They're not taught of the insulin elevating effects, the glucose elevating effects of protein. They're only taught carbohydrate counting for the most part. So when they go eat food, they're only focused on carbohydrates, which leaves people with type 1 diabetes to wonder, why is my blood glucose elevating 2 hours after I eat? I just nailed my blood sugar level with my insulin. And now 2 hours post, I'm seeing this elevation for the next 3 to 4 hours. What the hell is that about? Well, it's because they're never taught that protein has a blood glucose elevating effect for 4 to 6 plus hours, depending on how much you consume. Then that rapid acting insulin you took, which actually doesn't even match the speed of carbohydrates, it's much slower, only lasts for 2 hours. And so it's not going to last for much longer. So the average patient with type 1 diabetes, unfortunately, Shawn, doesn't even account for protein. But let's say you're one of these sophisticated low carb individuals who knows about the protein elevating effect. What do? They often take an insulin called regular insulin, which you can buy for $25 at Walmart. You can get a prescription for it. That actually seems to match much better the kinetics of protein with or without fat than any other type of insulin does. That's very rudimentary. Most endocrinologists, when they hear you talk about regular insulin, like, what are you going back to the 1920s, man? Like, why are you doing that? But the reality is that it's a tool in the toolkit of type 1 diabetes that most type 1s don't know about that brilliantly matches the kinetics, the blood glucose kinetics of protein. And this is the name of the game. It's kinetic matching. So you want to match the insulin kinetics to the glucose kinetics. And it does a great job at that. The alternative is that there's insulin pumps, which use rapid acting insulin usually in these pumps. And so that means you usually have to do what most patients, if you're sophisticated, you do a dual wave bolus. So you'll do an initial bolus for the protein, maybe about 50% of the initial bolus. And then you'll do a prolonged bolus for the rest of the 50% of the insulin for that protein over the next 4 hours, 3 hours. The idea being is that that's going to give you an initial bump, and then you're going to have a tail that lasts for the duration of the protein. That's what sophisticated users do. Your next question is about, is there too much? Is there a point of diminishing returns when it comes to protein? All comes down to the personal goals of the individual. I would contend that one of the biggest problems in society is obesity. It is now the same level of prevalence in type 1 diabetes as the general population. That's incredibly concerning, Shawn, because the rates of obesity used to be infinitely lower in people with type 1 diabetes pre-1933. It was the DCC and EDIC trial that showed that giving more insulin improved glycemic control. And despite taking more insulin and having higher body fat, those individuals had less complications for retinopathy, neuropathy, kidney disease, and cardiovascular disease. It basically improved all outcomes. Even though they were taking more insulin, the incidence of obesity at the start of that trial for all the participants, over 1,000, was 0. At the end of that trial, it was around 30%. So that just shows how important glycemic control is in managing long-term complications in type 1 diabetes. Does it mean insulin doesn't matter? Does it mean body weight doesn't matter? It absolutely does. But it just goes to show how important glycemic control is in that. But because obesity is now just as prevalent in type 1 diabetes as the general population, and we know that large-scale data in really prestigious journals like Lancet show that people with type 1 diabetes, only about 50% or less actually receive any type of nutritional guidance. Almost none are receiving low-carb guidance, and around less than half are receiving exercise guidance. And so as a result, high protein intake tends to be a strategy that is a very powerful lever to pull when trying to manage hunger, when trying to improve body composition. And so a lot of people often have reported benefiting from using protein as a foundational part of their food pyramid. So let's say you redid the food pyramid, Shawn, instead of just blowing it up, which might not be a bad idea. But let's say you redid the food pyramid. One way that people describe benefiting a lot is to focus as a foundation on protein and then building other things on top of that. How much protein do you need? Are you exercising? Are you full? Are you feeling satiated? Those are all factors that appear to make a major difference in how much someone can consume. But I'm gonna be honest with you, on a personal level, Shawn, I just try to hit enough. With exercising, I like to wake up and not eat a ton of food, but I actually found that doing jiu-jitsu now, working out multiple times a day, and all these other factors that I just have to have more frequency and more opportunities to get more protein in. So I do eat more frequent protein-based meals to get higher amounts of protein in to help with that recovery. But I don't really think there's really a ceiling here. There's no data that says that more is worse. It will require more insulin, but you would only be consuming more in theory because it's benefiting you from an exercise perspective, from a satiation perspective. And that benefit hopefully is being done to offset a consequence of some sort, which is why you might be consuming more protein in the first place. Because it's not common that people consume a ton of protein. I think that's more of the exception than the rule. But those people who do are usually doing it strategically to benefit them in some therapeutic way.
We've just unfortunately have a few minutes left, but I want to you did a 10-year analysis of your own self, I think, as a sort of, this is a 10-year type 1 diabetic managed on a low carb diet with exercise, and you looked at various outcome metrics. Would you describe what you found on that? Because, this is in contrast to what the normal diabetic would experience over 10 years. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's correct. And I'll be very brief because I know we're close here. There was really no long-term data about this risk-benefit analysis with doing this ketogenic diet. When you do a ketogenic diet, you increase fat intake, LDL often elevates for most people, assuming most things are controlled and you're not losing weight and your weight's stable. And so there's all this potential benefit in the context of type 1 diabetes of glycemic control, reducing insulin levels, reducing triglycerides, potentially improving blood pressure, all these other factors that are so powerful in the hierarchical list of risk factors, but yet it elevates LDL. So I was the lived experience of someone who has done a very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. I did a whole foods based 88 diet. I have records of all this. I've tracked all this. I had a DEXA longitudinally. I had HbA1cs over time, clinical chemistries, confirmed time on diet. I was tracking all this. I basically have about as good of data as you could possibly have of someone living with this disease. And I had maintained a ketogenic diet. I had maintained calories, maintained my body weight within 5% the entire time. No medication changes, about as control of a case report as you possibly can get. And so I said it'd be very interesting to report what is my longitudinal impact, because my LDL elevated.
How high did it go? How high was it, just for
So it was around 60s and it went up to 120. So I wasn't one of these like lean mass hyper responders of like 200, 300 level, but it doubled and it stayed elevated for over 10 years.
The average endocrinologist would want that number perhaps under 70 as a diabetic. Correct. Yeah. So you're 120. So clearly above what they would recommend.
Yeah. No statins. So no medication to lower it. And that was elevated the entire time. So you can actually see directly when I initiated the diet, the ketones, I'd confirmed no ketones, confirm elevation in ketones, LDL rose, and I controlled all these other factors and glucose levels into normal glycemia. So my average HbA1c over that time was 5.5% over 10 years. So what we wanted to do is look at advanced measures of cardiovascular physiology, with the idea being we wanted to see advanced early signs of atherosclerosis. So let's say I don't have a calcium score that might be elevated, or maybe I do, I don't know, we have to find out. But we can look at these signs of arterial stiffness, changes in hemodynamics within the blood that are early hallmark signs of atherosclerotic progression. And so we did these advanced assessments of arterial stiffness, pulse wave velocity, flow-mediated dilation, how the blood vessels respond to actual stress, all these, actually left ventricular function as well, looked at all these measurements. And the outcome of that was that while maintaining normal glycemic control over a 10-year period, despite that only happening about 1% of people with type 1 diabetes and elevated LDL, that the biomarkers I was seeing was not only better than the average person with type 1 diabetes of age-matched control, but oftentimes was better than those even without type 1 diabetes. And what that illustrates is this is the longest ever longitudinal report, not just in type 1 diabetes, ever with a ketogenic diet. It just so happened to be in a disease where there's way higher risk for cardiovascular disease, 10-fold higher risk with early signs of atherosclerotic progression. And there was no signs of adverse effects. In fact, there were signs of improvements among people with and without type 1 diabetes. One of the biggest criticisms we received, Shawn, was the idea that we didn't have a calcium score, the idea that that's the gold standard assessment. So I went and got one, and they all came back as 0. We're actually about to publish this. So in short, it illustrates, it's a case report. People say, well, it's just a case report. What the hell is that going to tell me? Well, there is no data anywhere close to this in type 1 diabetes. And let alone longitudinal, where you have pre and post data. So this is the longest ever done on advanced cardiovascular measurements of the ketogenic diet, regardless of a disease, but it happened to be in a disease with advanced atherosclerotic progression that happens much more rapidly and is the number one cause of death in that disease. And we saw that the ketogenic diet, despite elevations of LDL, did not appear to have any adverse effects on cardiovascular function, but actually seemed to reduce the risk if you look at relative historical comparisons to people with and without type 1 diabetes. And I think that's important because we have 0 data beyond 4 years of any longitudinal outcomes in cardiovascular disease in type 1 diabetes, let alone a ketogenic diet. And this is the longest report we ever have. So until we have better data in that same time frame, this is what we have to look at. that's why I think this is important.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to highlight there were some confounders that you maintain good body composition, you exercise throughout the whole time, because I think that's part of the equation as well. So we just say
100%
eat a ketogenic diet and sit on the couch and you're going to have the same outcome. I think it's probably going to be somewhat different. So, Andrew, thank you for doing this. This has been awesome. I really appreciate it, and this has been very insightful. And hope to talk again down the road. See how things go as you learn more stuff.
Honored, appreciate it, Shawn. And when I catch the deadlifts, I'll make sure I tag you on that.
Let me know.
Might do it private first, you know.
You'll inspire me to go back in there and lift again. So, all right, man.
All right.
Stop that. There we go. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Sorry, I got a black eye today.
I see that.
Yeah. Well,
what do you do? How do you get a black eye? You doing jiu-jitsu or something? What are you up to?
Actually, yeah, that actually is it. Yeah, I
get it. I do. I've done jiu-jitsu too, and I've had plenty of black eyes from that. So,
yeah, the other day I was walking home, and I'm like, "Why? It's weird." Like I didn't even feel it when I was there, and then I walk home, and I was like, "What the fuck did you just do?"
I had a lot of those. My wife would yell at me because my face would be all scraped up, and she's like, "What are you doing?" You know, and then you're too old for this shit.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, Andrew, it's a pleasure. How do you say it? You say Koutnik? How do you say that?
Yeah, you nail it, man. Most people don't actually get that right. So, yeah.
Andrew Koutnik. All right. And you got a PhD in what? Remind me.
Biomedical. So I have background in exercise phys. So my bachelor's degree in ex phys, but then it's biomedical sciences was actually the technical term for the PhD.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah. Well, let's just get started here. There's much stuff I want to chat to you about, if you don't mind. So
yeah, man, you go for anything and everything, Shawn.
Awesome. Awesome.
Don't hold back.
All right. I won't.